Welcome to Misteyre Creations. I'm your host AJ, and today I'm talking with Lance Oditt of Friends of Pando. This is a vital project to preserve one of the world's largest trees. It's a unique area of Utah, which we'll explain in the episode. Please join us. Welcome to the show, Lance. It's nice to have you on.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here with you.
All right. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and what Pando is, or where Pando is and what it is?
Yeah, my name is Lance Oditt. I am the co-founder and executive director of Friends of Pando. In America, in the stateside, we are a nonprofit, which is akin to a non-government organization in countries like Canada or Europe. We're recognized by the state of Utah and the IRS as a nonprofit organization. Our mission is we're working and dedicated to educating the public, supporting research and preservation efforts, and inspiring stewardship of the Pando tree, which is the world's largest tree. It's the largest aspen clone that we know of. We generally just say aspen tree, in this case, the Pando tree. It's the largest tree by weight, dry weight estimate. It's the largest tree by landmass.
Wow. How did you guys discover Pando?
Actually, Pando was discovered in 1976 by two aspen ecologists who were flying over its homeland. And 2 times a year, you can see Pando's outline from above because there are other trees around Pando and you can make out its outline. And so they were flying over the tree and documented it. And then they published their findings in 1976. So in this way, we're kind of still in this time of discovery that's just been 47 years ago.
Wonderful. Uh, how interconnected is the tree? Is it one plant, or is it multiple plants lumped together?
So Pando itself, the way that we know it's all interconnected is it wasn't verified until 2008. While it was discovered in 1976, and there was a lot of work to better understand what had been discovered because it's still an unprecedented discovery. In 2008, a team of researchers doing genetic research led by Jennifer DeWitty of the U.S. Forest Service, which oversees forest and watershed lands in the U.S., Karen Mock, who's a researcher, she heads up a department at Utah State University. Valerie Hipkins and Carol Rowe went through the tree's expanse and using fish poles and slingshots painstakingly gathered the leaves and then put that in liquid nitrogen and did genetic studies. And through those genetic studies, they plotted out the mass of the tree. And through that work, they figured out, oh, well, this stem here, the technical term is raiment, but this particular stem has the same genetic profile as this stem. These are all related. Now, within that kind of larger body, they did identify that there were some other smaller clones and certainly other trees. There's Douglas fir and spruce that'll dot Pando's landscape, but Pando is a dominant force. It hoards aspen or light hungry trees, so it hoards all of the sunlight, all the nutrients, all the water. So while there are other trees, singular trees or little tiny clones, by way of example, Pando is a couple of kilometers wide and long, where these others might just be a little dot on that larger map.
Yeah. Other trees and whatnot have a similar, like mangrove and that sort of thing, where they grow. It may not be the same tree. It may be different trees, but they may. Is it similar to that?
If I'm understanding your question right. What you're saying is there are other trees that kind of create these little ecosystems, like when you're
Yeah,
talking about mangroves.
yeah.
There's a lot of trees that clone in North America. Redwoods is another example. It's a reproductive strategy. Cloning is a reproductive strategy. Cloning is not necessarily like a primary feature of the tree itself. It's just how it
How
reproduces
it
itself over
reproduces.
time, right? And so a lot of different types of trees reproduce this way. I always bring up the redwood example because there's always it seems like there's always a question, well, how is Pando the world's largest tree? Because it's a clone, and some botanists don't think that that's a good explication. But in fact, many of our superlative trees in North America can reproduce asexually. Pando does produce pollen, and so it's very likely, the testing hasn't been done, but it's very likely there's a lot of sons or daughters of Pando in the same landmass where it lives there in southern Utah in the Fish Lake Basin. It lives up at about 8,600 feet or 2,700 meters. But Pando is the one we know is there because we've genetically tested it, we verified it, it's been verified through other means. And so, the cloning aspect is just the reproductive aspect, but how the tree works and how it coordinates energy production, defense, and regeneration across its expanse, I think is kind of really what sets it aside compared to other trees that can also reproduce asexually.
Excellent. Um, can you explain what suckering is and how Pando is uniquely compared to other aspen trees?
Sure. So all aspen trees can sucker. Sucker is just referring to a process where, with aspen trees in particular, there's a hormone cycle. So this is the ground. You have a stem that, these stems can reach 80 feet high up in the air. And so roughly 40 meters, 50 meters, give or take. And suckering is a process where in one stem, it builds up more of a hormone called auxin. Auxin's what sends the tree up into the sky towards the sun to gather energy, right? To gather light to do photosynthesis. At the ground level, there's another hormone, cytokinin, and that if folks want to go, I have a whole video about this hormone cycle on the Friends of Pando YouTube channel. When auxin is present, in other words, a tree that's high up in the air, growing happy, healthy, auxin is more predominant, and auxin suppresses the cytokinins in the root. When that particular stem or raiment falls down, auxin is no longer dominant. The cytokinins will kick up, and that will send up a new shoot or sucker. So suckering actually is kind of the verb form of the regeneration or the reproductive strategy. Some people will refer to that new growth that comes out of the ground that's stimulated by the cytokinins, now that the auxin is not suppressing it anymore, as suckers. And so they verb suckers for suckering, meaning, it's sending up a new stem. And that stem will be genetically identical to the root itself. And of course, the root is Pando's genome.
Pando. And the root kind of is it like a root ball, or is it a root expanse?
So Pando, in particular, and most aspen, but not all aspen, they send out lateral roots, right?
Yep.
And what that does is it builds up over time and kind of creates an anchor. So those trees that are upright, you've got this woven pattern of roots, right? That are kind of anchoring the tree to the ground. You see this strategy a lot with higher elevation trees. So what a lot of people refer to as tap roots is based off an old idea of how conifer work. Are they tap roots or lateral roots? But really, when you're talking about taproot versus lateral root, many trees will have root systems that'll go deep into the ground. Not the same thing as taproot. That's that concept is really about how the plant, or in this case, the tree, anchors itself. And so Pando sends out lateral roots. The conventional wisdom, although we've seen evidence to the contrary with the Pando tree at least, is that aspen roots can go as deep as about 3 feet, across the ground. However, Pando's landmass, there's about about 130 meters or 400 feet of elevation change, give or take, from the bottom of the tree to the top of the tree along this basin wall.
Mhm.
And so it seems like the root system with Pando is not only deeper than that 3 feet in the conventional sense, but it may have substructures that are bigger and gnarlier even still, because something we see in the Pando tree is a lot of times when a tree dies, or for example, in winter, they'll get icebound and they'll break, they'll just snap off. When they snap off like a matchstick at the ground. You rarely see a downed stem or trunk. Most people would call it a trunk of Pando uprooted. Like, to see Pando's roots is pretty special, because rarely does the whole tree come up out of the ground, because that lattice work is anchoring it. And so it'll just break off at the top, and you'll have kind of this, leftover snag that's maybe, 1 meter to, a meter and a half, and it just breaks off kind of like a matchstick. And so that's, another way to help us understand how that root system's all interconnected.
Have you been able to find possible uh, offspring that aren't connected to Pando itself?
I want to make sure I understand your question. Are you asking, have we found any of Pando's children because it
Yes.
produces pollen? Or are you, oh, okay. At this point, nobody has conducted the genetic research to do that. And there's some very good reasons for why. The first one is it's really arduous work. Anytime that you're approaching what you think is an aspen clone tree, um, you know, you can tell by the way the leaves change. You can tell by the leaf shape. You can tell by the root structures that it's related. But in terms of getting that genetic research, if you imagine it was a circle and you just had that circle and you started walking randomly from stem to stem or trunk to trunk, you could gather some leaves, but the one on your left may have a different genetic profile than the one on your right. So it's not only just arduous work in terms of like trying to get a leaf from, a tree that's 80 feet tall and making sure you're doing that consistently. It's also challenging because the one on the left could have nothing to do with the one on the right. And so to date, there hasn't been any other genetic studies that have been conducted that have confirmed that Pando has children. But it stands to reason that, based on the history of fire and other research we have on the tree, it's been there, Pando tree's been there for about 9,000 years. It stands to reason that it's produced enough pollen that it would have offspring somewhere in this geographic area. It's just never been proven at this point. It's pretty arduous work. The folks that did the genetic research, so Pando was discovered in 76. It really wasn't verified until 2008, right? It was conjectural until that point. So it's really just now, 2024. So, 16 years since Pando's verification. So there's a lot more research that we need to do. There was some clues, although never verified, that there were other large aspen clone trees in Pando's homeland, but no one ever documented that research. In fact, the people that discovered Pando said that there could be a clone out there that was 200 acres, or you can translate that into hectare. But it's never been verified. And really, we get asked this question a lot, well, what if we find a larger aspen clone? What will it mean? And we would be delighted. We'll be here either way. The reason that we care about Pando is because it's the largest tree in the world that we have now. And we would expect, if Pando is possible at 106 acres, there might be another aspen clone that's bigger. With Pando, though, the issues and the questions are really profound. You have a tree that's in a land that's been used by humans for 1,500 years at least. We have archaeologic sites around Pando's homeland that are some of the oldest in the state of Utah in the United States. So we would still take care of the Pando tree, and whatever we learn with Pando and however we treat Pando, whatever we learn and however we treat Pando, we feel pretty strongly that that's going to be useful to whoever, if another larger tree is discovered, how we approach that, how we think about that, our analogies, our scientific approach, our stewardship approach, the question about our role as humans as a part of nature. All of these things that we do with Pando certainly translate to other work in forest conservation.
That's great. Speaking about the prehistoric habitations, can you tell us a little bit about some of the known ones and the Fremont culture, please?
Yeah, but before I say anything else, I want to address Fremont culture. That is a colonialist concept within the indigenous community. The term Fremont culture really refers more to a time than a given people. Within the indigenous community, the period of Fremont culture involves a lot of different indigenous bands or groups. And so in America, folks talk about Fremont culture as part of sort of this indigenous epoch, these indigenous epochs. But for your listeners, I want to be sure to articulate that within the indigenous community, that's not a hard set, fast people, tribe, band. Having shared that, I touched on this earlier that we have archaeologic records in and around Pando's homeland dating back to around 10,000, showing that there were hunter bands that were there. A lot of people are surprised to learn that glaciers dominated Utah high mountain ranges until the end of the last ice age. And so we have hunting bands and we have points where people were hunting woolly mammoth, which are still in Utah at that time. As you start moving forward in history, colonialist concept calls these people the desert archaic people, and you're moving towards different climatic periods, right? And then, of course, some of these folks were nomadic, and some of these folks, they had their families, they stayed within a particular region. The next kind of point in time that we colonialists can understand the indigenous people of Utah, we do start seeing the carvings that are associated with what Europeans generalize as the Fremont people or the Fremont culture. In Utah in specific, we would be talking about the Paiute or Ute people in that time before colonization. And then later on, after Europeans start pushing indigenous peoples further and further towards the West with their expansion, we start seeing other groups, that are frankly being pushed into these lands. So Vachel Carter's team found evidence of indigenous people doing work for fire hungry or fire sensitive crops like amaranth, where they were using fire and that would stimulate the growth of these ancient grains. And so we have that evidence, and we have some other evidence because we have Europeans coming into contact with indigenous people there as early as 1700s, first the Spanish, and then later other groups that are coming west in the European American experience. And so what's interesting is that around 1300, Vachel Carter's work seems to indicate there was a great drought and a mini ice age. We have all of this human activity in Pando's homeland, and then all of a sudden, kind of everything stops. And, in our natural history of Pando and its homeland, we talk about this. There's a period of 200 or 300 years where we don't see a whole lot of human activity. It precedes colonialist. So it's possible there are other factors involved, but there's also a little ice age in that period too. And people got to remember that, Pando's in a montane environment. and so it can get very, very cold. And of course, it's prone to drought. There's droughts that have ran all people out of Pando's homeland and the surrounding areas. No water, droughts that could go on for centuries in that area. And so around 1350, we see this relationship with, what we call the Fremont culture seem to diminish. And then kind of all of a sudden in the 1600s, 1700s, we have new contact with the European colonists and their experiment, in exploration and government. And then we start seeing contact with the peoples that we have today, Paiute and Ute in particular.
Okay. Pando has some challenges to protect and restore the land. Can you talk a bit about the history of how you have restored and continue to protect the land?
So, Friends of Pando got started in 2019 informally. We just started doing these community calls where we would do outreach to folks, in and around Pando's homeland out there in South Central Utah. And so we've been involved in Pando's study or care as an organization for 5 years. We've been a nonprofit organization since 2021. So in the United States, anyway, if you want to partner with certain agencies, you have to be a registered nonprofit. And so we became formalized in that sense in 2021. Having shared that, Pando, unlike other trees, in many ways, we liken it to we can become Pando's constant gardeners.
Mm-hmm.
With clone trees like Pando, we can remove disease. We can stimulate the hormone cycle of regeneration. Aspen are light hungry. And so we can clear the ground. For example, there's a lot of juniper bush on the ground. These juniper bushes can be as big as cars and, 3, 4, 5 feet tall. And, they create hot spots in the tree, but you remove those, you open up ground where Pando can come through because aspen, they're light hungry. They're light shellfish is the term we use. In terms of Pando's care overall, it was discovered in 76. Pando's federal land stewards, which is the Fish Lake National Forest, which is part of the USDA in the United States, they began studies on removing diseased trees. They allowed folks to go in and kind of set aside some areas and said, if you see a tree that's got disease, it's not doing well. They noticed that the clone wasn't doing well and they were working to restore it. They allowed people to go into a couple of experimental plot areas and remove diseased trees. Now, some folks have characterized that as clear cutting. It was not clear cutting. It wasn't like clear cutting in the way that most common folks think of it, where you just go in and you just denude a whole mountainside. They set aside specific areas of the tree and they invited the public to go and basically help them tear out the diseased portions of tree. Because you got to remember, you can take out the tree that's diseased and not going to make itself well. That hormone cycle will kick over again. Once that stem falls, the auxin cycle drops, the cytokinin cycle goes up. And indeed, in some of those early studies, some of the most productive areas of the tree we see today in terms of rates of regeneration are where the Forest Service allowed people to collect. The Forest Service expanded on that. So that was the late 80s and the early 90s. The Forest Service expanded on that. And they went in and they added experimental plots. It was known as the Aspen Regeneration Project, where they used a couple of different methods to see how they could spur the most regeneration in the tree. And so that was about 15 acres all told. And again, this is the early 90s. But they found something out, and this is not altogether uncommon in the history of aspen ecology and restoration efforts at that time. There was sort of an arrogance about it that did kind of leave a legacy. What they found out is they had taken out the diseased portions of the tree, and they were getting regeneration out of that. And they were like, okay, let's build on that. So they also explored using fire low intensity ground fire, aspen are naturally fire resistant. They're called the asbestos trees or the asbestos forest in Canada in particular, but they started using fire to stimulate growth. They also did something called mechanical treatments. That's where they would do root ripping and things, because remember, all you got to do is tilt the hormone cycle a little bit. So they did fire, they did mechanical work. And indeed, they found that they were getting regeneration, but Pando sits right in the middle of an area that's surrounded by 700 square miles of de facto wildlife preserve or wilderness area, if you will, not identified as such, but national park lands, Bureau of Land Management lands, Forest Service lands, sovereign lands of the indigenous people, and private landholders. And they don't have Pando's care in focus, right? And all these animals are coming in from all around to go to the largest mountain freshwater lake in Utah, right? And so they did all this work to stimulate regeneration. It's working. This is awesome. And it gets mowed down. It gets mowed down by deer and elk. And likely there were some folks out there that were doing grazing work at the time, where today Pando's protected from that, but they were allowed, they were permitted to be in there. But the long story short is the deer and the elk mowed down all that new growth. And so we lost what at the time was a disease, but at least active part of the tree, to this experiment in the early 90s where they were trying to do the good thing. So they start installing fences, and the fences are set. The initial fences were not 8 foot. You need an 8-foot fence. But they start installing fencing. Indeed, we still see more regeneration, even though the 6-foot fences weren't adequate. Later, they added that to be 8 foot of fencing. That was 2019. But you see all of this work to do restoration. And so Friends of Pando is involved with the Forest Service, where one, protection, the fencing systems used to protect Pando, generally speaking, are effective. Two, we can do restoration work on Pando. We can very much treat it like a crop in one sense, and that we can stimulate its growth and manage its growth over time, right? And so we're involved with efforts to undertake restoration. As it stands right now, there hasn't been a formal restoration project in the tree in about a decade. We hope to change that in 2024, where we will be working with some other folks that live in the basin, cabin owners and things like that, and our crews, and working with our strategic partners at local colleges and the Forest Service and the Utah DWR. We'll go in and do more restoration work, although our focus would be removal of juniper. In some cases, it may be that some sage, what we call desert sage, is actually not a true sage. We could take some of that up. We don't want to take all of it up because it's vital habitat, but getting the juniper out, clearing the forest floor, if you will, and then any time that, like if you go into Pando and you dig a hole, if you're anywhere near a tree, Pando's roots respond to oxygen level changes. It'll send up a new root, right? This is disturbance-based, ecology disturbance-based approaches to Pando. And so we have plans to install about 23 additional acres of protection. And we got to have the fences in place first. But once those fences are in, where the deer and the elk can't come in and mow down all the great work, we can go back in, do juniper removal, do selective harvest of sages. We can use low intensity ground fire if we want to. We can also do root ripping, although that's a lot of work. Most folks, it's just a headache. It can be done, but it's a headache worth of work. We'll probably just stay focused on these other forms of restoration, because indeed, Pando being disturbance driven, it's one of those things where if a tree falls, another one's going to go up. It's not a perfect 1-to-1 ratio, but it changes. You got to keep in mind the whole tree is connected. It changes that whole equation where you have more of one hormone than the other. That can travel anywhere in the tree. And so that is kind of what we're talking about with restoration. And it's our goal as an organization that we do one restoration project a year, kind of dividing Pando's landmass up into workable areas of acres at a time, maybe a hectare at a time. We'll send in crews of 15, 20, 30 people take up the juniper, take up apportionments of sage or other invasive species, kind of open the ground for Pando, take out any diseased wood that's appropriate for that area, or where the Forest Service has insight based on their previous studies in the 80s and 90s with the removal of diseased wood. Keep all that fenced in, and we should expect to see regeneration. Indeed, we've seen a lot of success from those programs in the 90s, going into the 2000s, 2010s. There's been a little bit more mixed success, but we've also had a drought going on in the tree. And so the regeneration efforts, meaning adding new fencing was added in 2014, has been generally successful, but not as successful as the 1990s because we've been in a drought. So a lot of headlines that bear that notion. There's more to be said there, but that's kind of the gist of preservation and restoration work.
Here we have a restoration area where uh, it's a wetland restoration, not the same as Pando, but they take out diseased plants and invasive plants. Originally, it was drained and used as farmland. With Pando, did you
Yep.
see any of that effort, like where farmers used the area as farmland, and did you have to restore that sort of situation?
With Pando, no. But I do appreciate what you're saying about what's happening in your local community. We've got to take care of the land, and we can take care of the land in a different way. Um, with Pando in specific, Pando hugs the side of a very steep basin, and the land that Pando calls home was set aside before its discovery as part of like a national recreation area within the Forest Service domain, right? And so farming is not allowed in there. Indigenous folks do have land rights there in an area. They're not in Pando. They're in an area where their treaty rights are anyway. They're that's south of Pando, and so it's not restoration in that sense. However, talking about, I think that what you're talking about is a little bit more like most folks would call that a reclamation project,
Yeah.
and restoring wetlands for bird habitat, waterfowl, and changing things with water table, things like that. Pando's on this steep slope. A lot of the water that feeds Fish Lake, which Pando's about, a quarter of a kilometer from the edge of Fish Lake, that lake is in a really deep basin, and most of the water that Fish Lake gets is spring fed because Pando is on one side, you've got a 10,000-foot mountain, and on the other side, you got a 12,000-foot mountain, and Pando's in like the basin beneath that. So that land is constantly getting charged with water from these springs. We've undertaken some preliminary research to begin to understand water flow through the tree. And it may also give us a clue why has Pando been there so long. Based on the history of fire in the tree, there's been 5 or 6 conflagrations that have probably leveled the tree to nothing. And of course, Pando just reinvents itself from below ground upwards. But there's a really kind of compelling idea that why would this tree have survived droughts that have lasted as long as we've seen in the state of Utah, Pando's homeland writ large? And it very well may be that because it's in the basin and it hugs the basin walls, all the water that's coming into the basin and dropping down is basically kind of irrigating Pando from above, where the water comes in off the sides of the mountain, it seeps out the sides of the basin as it moves down into Fish Lake, meaning that Pando kind of has a constant water source and a huge watershed area.
Also the flow of water would bring new nutrients as it goes through the root system too, right?
Absolutely. Pando, the basin is still collapsing. It's a geologically active area. There's natural hot springs nearby. You can go to nearby Monroe Mountain and go sit in hot spring water, really nice. And so Pando's homeland in a long time ago, not very long in terms of geology, but in human time scales, was covered by these volcanic rocks. And you certainly had intrusions and things like that at different points. It's in an active fault area. Not a lot of earthquakes there, but these are kind of surface level faults. And so remember, Pando is disturbance driven. So anytime that you disturb the land, Pando can go and run up into that land, and it grows fast, right? 3 feet a year. And it can kind of take over before other trees can get busy and get going. Also, other trees don't survive those types of catastrophes very well. Pando actually thrives on them. And so, indeed, as that land has sunk, it's revealed all these old volcanic soils, which, as you know, are really rich for farmland and trees. And then as the water moves, it's also eroding and bringing more chemicals and nutrients, macronutrients that the tree needs down into Pando's homeland. So certainly advantaged it in that way, while the land literally just sinking and moving and moving and moving over time has disrupted the land again and again and again to Pando's advantage. It's very likely that the fact that it's in Fish Lake Basin, that land is kind of in motion in geologic time, and that you have it being a huge watershed were all reasons. Because some people are like, well, why would we have one genome? Pando is a genet. That's the technical term for an aspen clone, a genet or a clone tree. Why would it be there for that long? What gave it that kind of advantage? And you look at the land. We get these emails sometimes when people are like, oh, can you send us a cutting of Pando? I want to put it in the Sahara Desert. Or I'm in Pennsylvania and I want to put a Pando in my backyard, or Kentucky or wherever. What makes Pando unique is that intimate relationship between the tree and how it operates within that landscape. And so we've got a lot more research to do there. But indeed, to answer your question, yes, water and nutrient cycle is robust. The land is constantly moving and shifting in geological time anyway. And these are all great reasons for Pando to thrive, because it takes advantage of any disruption in the land. Anytime the land shifts, other trees get blown out, other things get moved away, Pando just heads right over and can make advantage of those situations that other trees just simply can't keep up with.
And in doing that, it kind of it creates habitat that's stable where
Yes.
other places it wouldn't be. Cool.
Yeah, in the language of botany, and aspen ecology is its own field of study in the larger school of ecological studies. Pando is referred to as a stable aspen clone, meaning that the tree and all the different stems, they're there, they can stay there, they dominate the nutrient cycle, they dominate the water cycle, because it's so big, and they all coordinate together. People, it's not just like there's this connection at the root, the way we think about highways or networks, things like that. Every single stem, estimated 47,000 stems or tree trunks of Pando, are sharing energy. They're all involved in producing energy, protection, and involved in that hormone cycle of regeneration across Pando's expanse. So it's a master coordinator. And so stable aspen clone is what people say versus sterile. You'll see a lot of sterile aspen clones in Canada there. You'll have a glacier or you'll have a landslide, and you'll see aspen pretty immediately after that. But eventually something will overtake it, typically conifers. It's called conifer succession. With Pando, we've seen periods where there's more conifers or less, but Pando is consistent throughout all of those epochs.
So basically it was able to get dominance before any of those came in and what would wipe it out.
Yeah.
Okay.
Pretty amazing, isn't it?
It is. It's an amazing plant to be able to not only live that long, but to go through all of the cycles and the intrusions of humanity, uh, trying to help but not really helping at the same time. It's kind of cool. How has Pando dealt with increases of stress due to climate change?
We get this question a lot, and I'm glad that we do. Right now, unfortunately, we don't have any one-to-one studies on the relationship between Pando and climate change as we tend to think of it. Timothy Morton talks about kind of as a hyper object event or a big event. What we do have with Pando is we have great histories on drought in its homeland. Of course, Pando is a higher elevation where other I have mixed feelings about this idea of ecotomes, just because there's a psychologist that worked on Pando years ago, and he's been kind enough to spend some time with us answering some questions. We try to spend time with anybody that's done work on Pando because we're losing that first and second generation of researcher.
Mm-hmm.
And he said something to me once. He said, when I was doing ecology work, people would ask me, is this land, meaning the land writ large that Pando calls home, or are we more Mediterranean and dry and hot, or are we wetter and cooler? And he said, Lance, it's really funny because like I could take you to around one hill, of this area of the world, and it would look like, drought is dominating, but then I'll take you up 300 yards or 300 meters of that, and you have lots of conifer and it looks like it's really wet. And he said something. He said, this part of the world, Fish Lake National Forest, and the way the Americans set up the land management, you pretty much have one of everything because of the extraordinary elevation changes. And so when we think about climate change in Pando, we certainly need to think about water. We've just seen, we're coming out of this drought period. We had a record snowpack in Pando's homeland last year. And indeed, we've seen the tree kind of light up like Christmas the past couple of years. We see more regeneration. We see more growth. We have some canopy studies, data dating back to 2020, 2021, when the tree was still kind of coming out of drought. Now we have canopy studies when it's fully out of that drought period. And so there's one question about snowpack, which melts off, and that would be charging the ground, but a lot of that's going to run off into Fish Lake when it melts. There's that aspect. Then what do we need to understand about the underlying hydrology? And indeed, we have a mandate, we have some work that we want to do to understand the broader hydrology of the tree. Where is it getting its water for most of the rest of the year? Because at Pando's elevation, snowpack plays a higher or greater role. So from about October to May, you have more snow-based precipitation, which some botanists liken to sort of a drought period because the snow is not melting, it's just there, right? And then in June, July, August, September, October, you have the summer rains at that elevation. And the summer rains, what's important there is you have monsoon type events, and there's trade-offs there. Monsoons are heavy rains, and so you have more runoff. Pando protects about 86 million gallons of water per year total, where otherwise that land would flood out, it would tear everything apart. And so it's capturing that. 1 inch of rain equals 2.3 million gallons of water across Pando's total landmass, right? And so when we're talking about climatic change, do we expect this montane region based on previous epochs going back to the most recent Little Ice Age? So when we're talking about climate change, we need to do more work looking at previous times, either the Little Ice Age or the end of the last ice age. We're in an interglacial period right now. We're using soil samples, sediment samples, things like that. We can reconstruct the climatic environment. There's been a little work there, but not a whole lot. This is a very remote area of the world, and while a lot of people visit there, it's not like a national park. It's really hard to get there. There's a road that goes through the tree, but you have to fly to Salt Lake and drive 3 hours and go up 10,000, 8,000, 9,000 feet to get there. And so mining that, we want to do more work this year around hydrology, because it seems compelling to us that because Pando's in a basin, basically a watershed, we can better understand the water cycle in that ecosystem in about 10 square mile area of Fish Lake Basin. But also it may lend some clues to us about its glacial past. why would we be talking about glaciers if we're talking about global warming, right? We're talking about the average temperature going up. And that's because what we really are looking at is the drier moisture. As I was saying, botanists, look at snow as almost like a drought condition.
Yeah.
Even though Pando can produce energy year round, it has chlorophyll in its bark. It can produce energy without its leaves. It's not nearly as efficient as with its leaves.
Mm.
But we would want to understand that water cycle in a different way, because here's something about Pando that's not true with some other environments. Because it's in a basin, and because it's in a watershed, and because we know that Fish Lake is mainly spring fed, in a way, we have a water loop. We can literally draw water from the water table beneath Pando and pour it back through the tree, just like a pipe in your house. Nobody's talked about this, but I'm just giving that to you as an example of understanding the hydrology may give us insights or cues about Pando's natural drought tolerance, how temperature affects regeneration rates and growth, how that's going to impact wildlife cycles, and then what other mitigating things can we do? Because really, if you talk about climate change in terms of temperature increase, that water that's on Fish Lake, it's going to be evaporating and it's going to leave off. So it's absolutely possible that we could draw from these springs. And as I say this, I'm sure there'll be people in the scientific community that will maybe poo-poo this or say you're crazy, but we can sustain a cycle of kind of watering the tree just like you would water a plant because of the watershed, right? And so there's no reason to say, even with climate change, we're going to see less groundwater if we see, less rain, higher heat. But because of Pando's arrangement in the basin, because of its proximity to a large watershed and a discharge area, there are some things we might be able to do for Pando above and beyond what we understand about its drought hardiness that would allow us to take care of the tree in a way we couldn't take care of any other natural subject the way we can Pando.
What came to mind talking about the basin? Um, at its tallest points, it would kind of act as its own. It would be like a terrarium, so to speak. It would
Yeah,
create
exactly.
its own atmosphere, so to speak, and that would trap moisture within that area and add to that cycle. It would just continually and trees are great at absorbing moisture from the air,
Yep.
and so it's it's really cool how that one location has created such a perfect storm for a tree to live as long as it has and be able to withstand all of this. Um, Also in the different elevations, because it goes through so many different elevations, it will be resistant to the weather in those situations, and it would filter that through all of it. So at its highest point where it gets a lot more moisture, it'll still be as resistant to the drier lower area or vice versa.
The terrarium analogy is good. Of course, it's not a contained system, and
No.
because it's higher elevation, the air is drier.
Yeah.
But when you have something like Pando that's responsible for protecting at least 86 million gallons of water a year, rough estimate, it's definitely different. It's part of the reason we need to protect Pando, right? Because it would continue, just in human terms, to uh, give us flood control, uh, give us places where water can collect. Aspen are watery trees, so they'll be holding water. But like if you think about climate change long term, there are a couple of risks to Pando in that way. We just don't have any data yet, but it's conventional wisdom and well documented that as we look at climate change events, humans think about this in human terms, but we're talking about geologic time, right? And weather over time. Starting out, as we see more CO2 in the environment, we should expect to see more growth from trees, right? but a tree's capacity to absorb CO2 and hold CO2 changes as it ages. So really old trees are well past the peak of carbon dioxide that they could sequester. Now, that's a very capitalist view when we talk about, sequestration and things like that, where it's like, oh, well, if we just plant 1 million trees, there's this writer that I really like, and he kind of said that's a poverty of thought about capitalism. We shouldn't just think of the term and, the tree in terms of what value does it have. We can also think of the tree in terms of how it all fits together and how we're part of that. And I like that idea. So, we would expect with climate change based on existing models, but no data we have on Pando itself yet, that initially we would see more growth. There would be more carbon in the environment, right? CO2, the trees would kind of explode. But then as we see global temperatures rise, we're also going to see something else. We're going to see more trees. They're going to be they'll be bringing more moisture through them.
Yeah.
But at a certain point, you start talking about, in layman's terms, sort of a pump effect. It's going to be hotter where trees would be trying to pump more and more water through, but they're not going to be able to get rid of all of that CO2 or water. And so we're going to hit not only the point where as trees age, they don't hold as much carbon dioxide as a sink in that sort of impoverished capitalist view, but also they're going to hit a point where they can't use any more water. They're not going to hold or produce or do any better with the CO2 in the air. They'll be saturated. And some have theorized that once they're saturated in this, again, layman's term way, that they won't be able to do the work that they've been able to do with the gas concentrations of the atmosphere the way they have since the last glacial period, right?
Yeah.
And so these are things we also need to think about with Pando, and we've got to develop models and plans to be thinking not just now, not just 10 years from now, not just 100 years from now, but if we really want to take care of Pando as one of the longest lived things on Earth, and we want to think about Pando as a unique, genetic citizen as its own thing, that's been around for 9,000 years, we're going to have to start thinking a lot more long term, hundreds of years, thousands of years. We're thinking into time periods where even the language that we're using here, Alan, the words wouldn't even mean the same. But you keep in mind the tree's been doing that for 9,000 years. It'll be a good challenge for us. So I bring those things up, but it's hard to talk about directly in context of Pando because we know so little. Pando was really only verified in 2008. We know so little about the tree, and yet, we feel so confident in our assertions. And that's kind of a story about the history, of science, not necessarily the history of the tree in some cases.
There's some areas where science has to catch up.
Very much indeed. Some folks have asked us, monocultures. Folks are afraid that restoration work will promote a monoculture in Pando. And monoculture is a term that humans use to refer to critical crops, right? Using genetic modification, which humans have done in some way or another, whether it's in a lab or in the field. We've modified crops to benefit us, right? Some folks have expressed concern about monoculture in Pando. Pando stands there and goes, I invented the word monoculture. It's the same genome and it's that big and it's been there that long for that many years. Nature has its own sophistication in ways. And so some folks are worried that some of the restoration work, maybe it's not a good idea. This is why you'll hear me say we need to think of Pando as living and dynamic. Hear me say that amoeba analogy. It's kind of shifting shape and form over time, and using that idea that if any one part or section of Pando survives, it'll go off in its own direction again. And so we need to be respectful that it has, in human terms, a different life way, a different approach to the challenges of what it means to be alive and be part of a natural dynamic that's operating on the Earth scale.
When humanity likes to look at things through the lens of humanity and plants and animals, they're not humans. They're themselves, and they live on a scale of their own. And we have to come to terms that we're not the ones who control that. It's them. So yeah.
Yeah, I find it compelling how how trees figure in human cultures. There's an anthropologist, also happens to be from Canada, named Wade Davis, and he has this really great book, The Wayfinders. And there's a couple of things he talks about in there. One of those things is other cultures aren't failed attempts at becoming you or your culture. And then I love that quote. I love the underlying principle of that. And the other thing he talks about is this idea of the ethnosphere, that there's all these layers of geology and what's going on with the earth, and humans are the ethnosphere. In other words, the ethnographic sphere of the earth. And in the way he describes it, as I understand it, is this idea, and I think it's beautiful, as the first statement is, and I'll tie them together here in just a moment as I understand them. But there's this idea that all human cultures are really ways of thinking about and interacting with nature. We have to understand nature to be part of it. Never mind, take care of it. And so, in the first case, other cultures are not failed attempts at becoming you. Trees they're not. It's we got to be really careful not to personify them in human terms. But isn't it compelling that in our human hearts we look at trees and we give them names like Pando, and we say, how is that community of trees talking or communicating? These are all our bad analogies for like how things could work together. It's not a failed attempt on the trees if our analogies don't map. It is us trying to understand our role in nature. And then in the second case, of course, by understanding our role in nature, in the case of Pando, we can become its constant gardeners. The tree still may have other plans still besides that, right? But based on its life and what it's done so far, in that way, we could be, in our human terms, working to help and sustain the tree and learn the other lessons that it has for us. And if we do find something bigger in Pando, I said this earlier in our talk, whatever we learn at Pando culturally, scientifically, you could break that down by geology, botany, genetics, climate, technology, whatever we learn from the tree in terms of our ability on this sphere of the ethnosphere to work together, to collaborate, to take care of things together. Whatever we learn at Pando will be applicable to any other, large life form like this that we find we have a responsibility to take care of in a new way as we go along with our cultures. But the tree will also have lessons for us throughout that. And so I love that way that Wade Davis kind of makes all of that elegant. And I love that he does so without insisting that we get into panpsychism with trees, or that we get into this mindset that our cultural analogies for how trees work, oh, they talk together and things like that. It's okay if they're not complete. We just need to be careful not to be arrogant about that, and to be kind to the thing that we're trying to take care of, and that we're compassionate listeners. We listen to the tree over time. Monitoring is really about listening to the tree in our human terms, but also that we're kind to ourselves, that we're on a journey with taking care of the tree, and that collaboration is hard work, and that the money and the effort involved in taking care of this tree, which is in a very tumultuous landscape, involves long-term thinking. And sometimes humans are good at that and sometimes they're not. And we need to be compassionate with ourselves and build things in such a way that we are compassionate. That's why our motto is a friend of Pando is a friend of mine. Anybody that's got good faith, long-term thinking, with Pando, they can work with us, but if they want to go in there and tear it up, we're not going to work with them on that. But if they want to come out and put on their gloves and their boots and help with fencing for a day, or they want to educate kids, or they want to help us do a soil study, we're here, we're open. We're not the only people with questions. We're not the only people with potential answers or solutions. But the core of our programming as an organization is focused on making sure we're spending the time to invest in the human aspects of culture that'll take care of the tree. And while we do so, leave ourselves open to the idea that there's a lot more lessons we have to learn, and opening up opportunities to learn those things as we work to take care of the tree, just being ourselves as humans.
Friends of Pando is a non-profit project to preserve the Pando tree. This tree is the biggest tree in the world, with a size of about 143 acres. They have committed to the study of the tree with the aid of students and professors from universities in Utah and around the world. Please check out their website, www.friendsofpando.org. If you have experience with the study of rainforests in BC and think you could help them with soil studies, please contact me at parasortium@gmail.com. We'll put you in touch with Lance and go from there. This project is important in many ways. Please watch the episode and get involved if you can.